Let's talk more about this. We're joined by the SNP's Mhairi Black. Thank you very much for being with us. We've just seen the details of the first poll since Nicola Sturgeon's evidence. Are you concerned that this is now starting to damage support for independence?
Well, I mean, I think that's been in the back of the minds of any SNP supporter for a long time now. But I think the important point is that these polls just give a snapshot, and this particular poll isn't comparable to previous polls, so I would take it with a pinch of caution. But ultimately, it goes to show that we cannot take anything for granted, you know. And one of the things that I actually have always liked about the SNP is that we've been very upfront in saying that it is on us to convince people of the case for independence. So it just shows that we still have work to do.
And I take your point that I think it's right that it hasn't been weighted for turnout, for example, this poll, so not necessarily directly comparable. But you do acknowledge that there are concerns within the SNP that what we've seen play out between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond could have damaged that support. Well,
I think that the conflict within any political party can often lead to damaging. It's certainly damaging the reputation and the look of the party, but I don't think that that's necessarily what is happening just now. And it touches more broadly on this harassment inquiry in general. And I think a lot of people are almost trying to force agendas onto these issues. And the real issue at the heart of all of these, the things that we're talking about, is the women that, you know, were complaining, the complainants. And ultimately, as politicians, I think we have to ask ourselves that throughout this saga, have we made it easier or more difficult for people to come forward? And I think that's what the focus should be, rather than, you know, internal party politics as such.
And what do you think the answer to that question is?
To the question of
whether it's easier for women to come forward?
Oh, I wouldn't say so, no. I think the way that this inquiry has played out has just been horrendous. And I can't imagine the horror of the experience that the complainants are having just now. And there's a couple of things to make clear. The first thing is the Scottish Government did make a mistake in terms of how they actually implemented this policy. And it's actually quite refreshing, I think, to see the First Minister in particular put her hands up and sincerely say, yeah, no, we could do better. And that's what the point of this inquiry should be, is to figure out how can we make sure that this kind of mistake never happens again. And instead what we've had is just this barrage of conspiracy theories, of attacks on our institutions, of clear political agendas taking precedence over what is a very serious issue.
OK, I mean, you say that the Scottish Government has admitted mistakes, that it's refreshing that Nicola Sturgeon has held her hands up, but no one's resigned, have they? Is that really taking responsibility?
Yeah, I appreciate your point. And in terms of resignations and things, I think it's important to remember that the committee inquiry has still to be published. So, you know, I think it would be a bit presumptuous to start, you know, sacking people right now.
But you've just said the government let people down, though.
Would
that not be the right thing to do, to take responsibility?
Yes, but I think that it's important that we figure out where that responsibility actually lies. And in terms of the implication that this somehow lies with the First Minister, I would say that's where we know that there is a current inquiry being undertaken by James Hamilton, which the FM actually referred herself to for further scrutiny on top of the committee inquiry. So I can't help but notice the double standards as well here, because, you know, when we talk about these issues, we've heard the Scottish Conservatives in particular, for instance, they put out a press release before the First Minister had even given evidence to the committee calling for her to resign. And that's just ludicrous and shows what the real agenda is there. But in comparison, a court has shown that Boris Johnson has misled Parliament, and yet I'm not seeing any 8 hours questioning sessions for him or seeing him submit himself to the kind of scrutiny that the FM is.
It's not about Boris Johnson, though, is it? What we're talking about here specifically is what is happening in Scotland. We're talking about Nicola Sturgeon as well. Just looking at the ministerial code, it's quite clear. The Scottish Government's ministerial code says legal advice should be considered at the earliest opportunity. Now, on the 31st of October 2018, the government's own lawyers said its argument in the case against Alex Salmond was more likely to fail than succeed. On the 6th of December, they said that the least worst option was to concede the case. So why did it take until 8th of January the following year for that to happen?
Well, I mean, there's, again, a few different things to consider here. What has been published so far and what the FM made clear was that there are continually different legal opinions throughout a process. And what the government were advised is, look, that we are now starting to see cause for concern in our case. However, we think that the legal grounds themselves are sufficient enough to keep pushing this. So it kind of comes down to, in my view, the semantics and the details of the institutions and the law themselves. So I think it's important to let due process take its place. So, but the FM's been very clear that the moment that it was made clear to her that the case there was no point in pursuing it,
How can you say that, though, that the moment she thought that the case wasn't going to be there, when on the 31st of October, the government's own lawyers said the case was more likely to fail than succeed, 6th of December, the least worst option was to concede the case, and yet you didn't do anything till the 8th of January? I mean, it doesn't really sound that way, does it?
Well, no, there's also a couple of things to consider, because legal advice is made up of different sources, so there's a lot of different things to consider. In the October letter that you're referencing, my understanding is that there was still grounds for it to be pursued in court, because the distinction that I think was important that the FM made is that where the flaw was in this process was in how we implemented the policy. The actual policy itself remains intact, it remains in effect and currently untested. So I know it's a slight point, but I think it's an important one.
So the ministerial code may have been broken, according to critics. The government has acknowledged it acted unlawfully. You yourself say that the complainants have been let down. Over £500,000 of taxpayers' money has been lost. At some point, does someone need to resign for this?
Again, I think it's important that we let inquiries take their process. I think it would be inappropriate for me to, be making assumptions on that we have these.
But these things aren't assumptions. I'm talking about things that have happened.
In what sense? We don't know that
acting
the ministerial
unlawfully
code has been broken.
The money.
The FM's been very clear that
women have been let down, as you said.
Yes, no. The fact that women have been let down completely, and I think that's again my first point, is where the committee inquiry, I think its focus should be looking at, right, well, what is it that went wrong? And my understanding is that it was to do with prior communication with complainants, that was the issue around the actual implementation of the policy. But like I say, are we making it easier or more difficult for people to come forward? And I think when you consider how the women at the heart of this have actually been weaponised for different narratives, that has been the most upsetting thing for me to see. And of course, the government should face scrutiny, and I don't see any evidence to suggest that the government are trying to evade that scrutiny, but I think it's important to let processes play out.
The government should face scrutiny, but should the government also be held accountable?
Of course.
Does someone need to take responsibility and lose their job?
Well, of course, but you're asking me, should someone lose their job over something that we don't know the complete...
No, but I'm asking you whether they should with respect, whether they should lose their job over things that we do know. The government's acted unlawfully.
Right,
women, as you say, have been let down. £500,000 worth of taxpayers' money lost. These are things that we know.
No, completely, I understand that, but who is it in particular that you're thinking that you're asking me whether they should resign?
Well, either the First Minister or who else you think that was responsible for the mistakes that the government made?
Well, like I say, these reviews are currently in motion just now to identify what went wrong and where it went wrong. And actually, one of the things that has hampered that process is constantly having to rebut the wild conspiracy theories that have been touted by some.
OK. Now, tomorrow is International Women's Day, important day, of course. Women have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic in Scotland, but across the UK and also across the world as well. And whether you look at things like domestic abuse, childbirth, women in the workplace, are you worried about the impact that the pandemic's had on women's rights?
Yes, the impact that the pandemic has had on women in general. Sadly, the trend in most areas of politics seems to be that issues predominantly affect women much worse than they do others. And the fact that we know, as you alluded to earlier on in the programme, that single parents in particular have been really struggling during this period. It's undoubtedly been tough.
Yeah, I think certainly lots of people would agree with that. You've previously, of course, criticised Westminster for being a bit of a boys' club and for being a sexist institution. What has your experience been?
Exactly that, to be honest with you. I think Westminster in particular, it does. I think the people within it often have a view that it is some kind of private membership club, and it's very bizarre at times, and the manner in which I think people conduct themselves often is very macho, if not outright misogynistic at times. So yeah, I've certainly experienced it. But on the other hand, I have experienced the an attempt to raise awareness about these issues and an attempt by Parliament to address some of these issues. So I do have to give credit where it's due. At least they're trying.
Yeah, definitely still worth trying. I mean, you're saying that you've sort of experienced or seen things that are misogynistic. What kind of things are you talking about?
Well, the one that always springs to mind was the first time that I was elected. I was sitting out in the terrace, and there was a elder member, I'll say, who sat down with me, and I remember asking, "When is it again the summer holidays are?" And they leaned in and said, "I think you'll find it's called recess, darling." And I had to reply, "I think you'll find I'm called Mhairi, sweetheart." So, just daft things like that happen much more often than they should. And that begins to seep out into the narrative and how we talk about other issues. And I think that particularly when it comes to poverty and the pandemic, we are seeing that a lot of people in government and in Parliament in general don't quite get it. They're not seeing how it is impacting women disproportionately and why that matters and why we have to do something to address that.
Yeah, certainly something worth highlighting ahead of International Women's Day. Thank you so much for being on the programme,
Thanks,
Mhairi
Martin.
Black there.